Okay, well, welcome everybody. Glad to have you all here. Sustain Rockford is a grassroots membership nonprofit working to help the Rockford region become more sustainable. You all are our base of support and the drivers of what we do. We are not top down. We have at the moment, we have no paid staff. It'd be nice if we had that, but we don't at the moment. You guys are the action. You guys are the energy. And we are only as strong as our members. And together we are committed to this as a community. So we want you to know that you are valued, whether you're a member or not, but you are valued as being part of it. We're grateful to have Claudia Denton here tonight. And she's going to talk to us about greenhouse gas surveys. Claudia is an experienced climate change professional, providing clients with technical research and analysis in both the public and private sectors. Her specialties include greenhouse gas inventories, or GHG inventories, climate action plans, mitigation analysis, life cycle analysis, and management/technical tool development. She'll also act as a greenhouse gas tool developer for Parametrix. That's the company in which she works. Parametrix carbon calculator, which is called Climatemetrix, Paul. And for operations in communities, she lives in the Eugene, Oregon area. And it may be of interest to some of you that Claudia grew up in Sweden and immigrated when she was 10. So for some of you who may have Swedish roots, there it is. And also she works in the Pacific Northwest, but Parametrix has 10 offices in the US, one of which is in Chicago. So everybody say hello to Claudia.
Hello, everyone. All right, so I will first be doing a little GHG inventory 101 for you all. So first things first, what is a GHG inventory? I know a lot of this is a little bit basic and perhaps boring, but I think this is the most exciting beginning parts. So it is really an accounting of greenhouse gases. They can be emitted to or removed from the atmosphere. It's during a specified period of time, generally a calendar year, can also be a fiscal year if it's for an organization. And it can be for an organization or a geographic boundary, which really just means a community. So a business, a nonprofit, a community, a city, a county, a country. You can choose what your boundaries are. There are specific protocols to guide you depending on what you are choosing to do. As we know, GHGs are mostly from burning of fossil fuels, but there's also non-fossil fuel sources, including refrigerants for air conditioning and refrigeration, wastewater treatment, waste disposal like landfills, and land use change, where we're cutting down trees or vegetation, or changing from development to a reforestation. And then GHG inventories provide an emissions baseline for your community or your business as a way to track your emissions change over time and any progress towards goals. There's different greenhouse gases, 7 different types, but the main ones are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Those are the vast majority of the GHGs that we're concerned about. There's other high GWP gases. I'll explain what that means in a minute. But you can see there's the greenhouse gas name, the chemical formula, and what's called the global warming potential. So these are all different gases. They do different things in the atmosphere. We need a way to normalize this so we can have an inventory that is kind of an apples to apples comparison, so we're not having a whole fruit basket. So everything is in relation to carbon dioxide. It has a global warming potential of 1. Methane, on the other hand, is much more potent. It's about 28 times more potent by mass than carbon dioxide. So it has a GWP of 28, nitrous oxide even more so, 265. And then these other high GWP gases can be up to about 24,000 times as potent as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These numbers, you might have seen different versions of this. They vary depending on which IPCC assessment report you're using, if you're looking at 20-year values or 100-year values, or actually I think there's even 500-year values. But the International Panel on Climate Change, right, the IPCC, the fifth assessment report, these are the most commonly used right now. There is a newer version. The federal government uses the older version, AR4. It's all in all, it's fairly similar. They just get a little bit better with their science each and every time. And the 100-year values are kind of the most common way to measure and look at things. All right. So what is 1 metric ton CO2e? As I just said, we need a way to normalize it. So we have the results in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2e. And 1 metric ton CO2e is about the same as a passenger vehicle driven 2,500 miles. So you can imagine if you drive your car 10,000 or 15,000 miles a year, it's 4 to 6 metric ton CO2e per year for that car. It's about the same as 13% of a U.S. home's energy use for a year, 46 propane cylinders for home barbecues, or 1.2 acres of forest sequestration. So not what the forest holds, but what the forest removes from the atmosphere in growth for 1 year. So the 1.2 acres of forest removals for the year. And so you can imagine that cube on the right, the image with a house and the cube of gas, that is what visually 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide looks like in relation to a person. So you can imagine how many of these we are each responsible for releasing each and every year. Inventory boundaries. I have the rest of this presentation is for a specific community in the Pacific Northwest.
You want me to sit in your office?
What's that?
I'm going to sit. Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
I was on mute. Sorry.
So, for a community, there's different scopes of what's considered in or out of boundary. For a community, everything inside your geographic boundary is considered scope 1. So, any sort of burning of gasoline or diesel, any sort of release of refrigerants, anything that is handled inside the community is scope 1. Not typically all that much for a city. If you have a larger, say, a county where there's a landfill or there's agriculture or a lot of industry, there's a lot more going on. But for a city, somewhat limited. Scope 2 is a little bit interesting. It's energy, primarily electricity that is being generated elsewhere. So the emissions are occurring elsewhere, but you're using that energy inside of the community. That's scope 2. These are sort of the 2 scopes that are the bare minimum of GHG accounting. You can't really do an inventory without having at least scope 1 and 2 emission sources. But we know that that's still not a complete picture of what it truly takes in terms of emissions for a community to run, for everything that you need and use. So there's also scope 3, and these are emissions that are occurring outside of the community, but that are due to demand or generation from inside of the community. So all of your landfill waste or perhaps wastewater treatment, air travel, and we talk a lot more later about food and goods like furniture and things like that. So scope 1 and 2, again, the most common kind of bare bones part of a GHG inventory, but scope 3 is a very significant part of the complete picture as well. So when we did this GHG inventory for Battleground, Washington, a small community, it was for calendar year 2022 and for the city jurisdiction. And I want to point out that we followed GHG Inventory's GPC protocol. There's many different protocols out there. It's not necessarily the most common in the US, but it is the most common standard worldwide. One of the very leading protocols. And I wanted to point out also that doing a GHG inventory is the very first step, real major step anyway, in a climate action plan process. So you have your hotspot analyses, right? You can do GHG inventories, or for your business, climate materiality or climate risk analysis. knowing what matters to you and what activities are relevant for you. Then you do goal setting. You figure out where it is that you want to be, what makes sense in terms of the best science and best practices, not necessarily what's realistic, but where you have to go. You develop your climate action plan, few steps involved there, and then you continue the cycle by measuring and reporting out over and over. For a city or a community, generally every 2 to 5 years is appropriate for redoing your GHG inventory and comparing where you were to where you want to go. Okay. So Battleground Washington, this is their 2022 GHG inventory results. I'll explain how their results might be similar or different from how I would imagine Rockford might look. This is a smaller community, 25,000 people on the outskirts of the Portland, Vancouver metro area, just north. So it's a little bit more rural, but still a suburban community there. Washington State, it's got a lot of hydropower, for example. I'll point out how that might be different from Rockford. And let's get into it. So, total emissions for this community, again, about 22,000 people for 2022, 286,000 of those metric tons CO2e. That comes out to about 13.1 metric tons CO2e per capita for total. I will say there's a few things that make this community's emissions really quite low compared to other communities. You'll see there on the left, we have the local emission sources. We have building energy, primarily electricity and natural gas, perhaps some propane and fuel oil. We have transportation. We all know this is primarily gasoline and diesel, but really any energy that is moving. So all kinds of equipment and vehicle, trains and airplanes and cars and electric vehicles are also included here. Solid waste and wastewater, so primarily landfills. There's a few other things, like if you have incineration as your waste management source. Wastewater, so primarily centralized wastewater treatment. If you have septic, it would be included in here. I don't think there was a lot of septic included for this community. And then industrial process and product use. It makes it sound like this is just industry stuff. Not quite. This is mostly refrigerants. So from your air conditioners, refrigerators, any sort of other cooling and chilling equipment. There are other sources, I'll talk about those later, that could be included here, but are not in most communities anyway. And all combined, these are your local emission sources. This is a combination of scope 1, 2, and 3. So not just scope 1 and 2. And they are, again, sort of that bare minimum of what you should be looking at if you're doing a GHG inventory. Compare this to what you see there on the right, the imported emissions. These are emissions that are occurring entirely elsewhere, but it's due to the community's buying of goods or services, buying of food, purchasing of energy, so electricity upstream, natural gas upstream, gasoline and diesel, everything it takes to produce that energy, not just what you're getting to use, right? Because there's more emissions associated with that energy. And then air travel. We know this is quite significant. The main differences in terms of data and reliability and things like that are generally the local emissions. You have real activity data. You can talk to utilities. You can talk to the landfill. It's generally more real numbers behind the data, or if you do have to do estimates, it's based on downscaling from state level data. That's more reasonable. Compare that to the right side of imported emissions. This is more heavily modeled and based on assumptions of what people do with their money, right? Everyone has to eat, so I'd say food production is actually pretty reasonable, but goods and fuel and air travel, this is a little bit more modeled on based on kind of more national expectations of what people do with their money, what emissions are associated with producing those goods, things like that. So This data is specific to the Pacific Northwest, but I think there's some really interesting things that you could learn from that would be very much applicable to Rockford as well. Here you see a little bit more detail of what's included in your local emissions. So of that, let's see, 286,000, about 100,000 metric tons CO2e are local emissions. Again, this is quite a low number. I'll explain that more in the rest of the slides, but about half of it is from building energy, a little less than half on transportation, and smaller still, those refrigerants as part of the IPPU, we call it, and then solid waste and wastewater. This is actually fairly typical. I just often see bigger numbers. But in terms of the share breakdown, this is pretty typical for a community. Especially building energy and transportation being the main two. Sometimes there's more transportation, sometimes it's more building energy. And then comparing that to imported emissions, almost double of what the local emission sources are. Half roughly are from goods, from the stuff we buy that we use and that we do need for the most part. I'll talk more about what the emissions are from goods. And then air travel, roughly 9%. This can vary depending on how the behaviors of the community, how they choose to travel, how much they choose to travel. But this is an estimate for air travel for this community. It's relatively affluent. And then food production, roughly a quarter. And fuel production, again, that electricity, natural gas, gasoline, diesel, etc. The upstream emissions from that energy, not the using of the energy. So, building energy. There's residential, commercial, and industrial energy uses. If you're a mostly residential community, this is going to be more of where your emissions are. If you're a colder climate, it's going to be a lot of natural gas. If you're a warmer climate, it tends to be more electricity. If you're in a rural and aging community, there might be other like propane and fuel oil that's more included here. There's also little traces of other fugitive emissions from energy utilities. Like if there's big natural gas activities, there's some fugitive methane from that. Or some gases, specialty gases that's part of electricity infrastructure that are included in these local emission sources. So we're pretty familiar with these. Here's what that looked like for Battleground. Really small footprint for them on this electricity. As I mentioned, there's a lot of hydropower in this area. So that's not necessarily renewable, but it's lower GHG. I am not sure what the local utilities in Rockford purchase or generate, but electricity could easily be up to 10 times higher for another community. I would suspect it's somewhere between 3 to 5 times this electricity use if the use part is consistent. But in terms of the emissions associated with the electricity itself, this is pretty low. It is often higher. Natural gas varies a lot depending on climate, so I would expect this to be higher as well in Rockford because it's colder in the winters than it is in Battleground. And then those other little gray boxes are the propane and fuel oil. So this is pretty unique to them. There's different parts of the country where it might look like this, but it's not the most common, and this varies. Electricity varies the most out of everything around the country. Next, we have transportation. This is also quite familiar for folks, right? On-road vehicles, off-road vehicles, and equipment, whether it's from landscaping or it's from farming, there's all kinds, or construction. There's a lot of that other than just the on-road vehicles. There might be rail, freight and passenger rail, or aviation. So aviation only really applies if there's an airport in the community. Otherwise, it's part of that imported emission source, but if there's a local airport, that would be included. So we know this: gasoline, diesel, electricity, perhaps other fuels like aviation gasoline or jet fuel or things like that. Propane. So here's what that looks like for Battleground. I think this is pretty typical depending on what's going on with your community, unless you're like a farming community or a county. So most of this is from passenger cars. We know that this is mostly gasoline. There's this tiny sliver of electric vehicles, some freight, so diesel, larger vehicles, a little bit of transit. They have, I believe the transit agency here does use a share of renewable diesel. So I don't think that brought it down too much, but transit is notable since it's running all the time, helping people make better choices. Off-road, this is primarily from construction for this community, a little bit of rail. And on the left, you could see this is only the local emission sources of transportation. But on the right, fun if you put in that air travel component from other airports outside of the community, that takes a big chunk of your transportation emissions if you include that. So think about all the different ways that you travel, not just your own car. So industrial process and product use, that IPP that I talked about earlier, mostly refrigeration and air conditioning in your homes, your businesses, your industry. It can also be in your cars. But it can also include special industrial processes and manufacturing. Chemical plants, this is a really big one for chip manufacturing, like silicon chips and whatnot in the tech industry. And these are emissions, if it's for a business, that they are occurring locally and the community's responsible. But in the end, if we're all purchasing these products, computers, cars, phones with these specialty products, then that's part of our consumption-based emissions as well. So these are non-energy gases. It's not really going to be carbon dioxide or anything like that. This is higher GWP gases. So a really small amount can have a really big footprint. So fugitive emissions of that kind, leaky air conditioners and whatnot. So for this community, only refrigerants were applicable. I'm not sure if Rockford has a significant industrial sector, but any sort of non-energy emissions would be included here. And I've seen this be as high as 30-40% of a community's local emission sources. And that was a community with just 2, perhaps 3, but really 2 predominantly, 2 private businesses that produced chips. So it can be significantly higher. This is often overlooked in GHG inventories just because it's not part of the energy piece. So don't want to forget about those. Waste and wastewater, we talked about this a little bit as well, should be quite familiar. Solid waste, wastewater treatment, septic systems. So once again, these are non-energy components. So all the building energy is accounted for those facilities, all the pumping and everything, the electricity needed. But the methane and nitrous oxide generation is what's included here. There's different versions of wastewater treatment. Some create more methane than nitrous oxide. Some create more nitrous oxide than methane. There is no perfect system, but the main thing you can do is see if you can avoid generating those gases, and secondarily, if you can contain and use or at least burn those gases, because burning methane is much better than releasing methane. Once again, fairly typical for a community is solid waste is the bigger portion and wastewater is the smaller portion. In rural communities, septic is a lot more intense in terms of GHGs than centralized wastewater treatment. So we can be grateful when we have centralized wastewater treatment for more reasons than one. There's different ways that landfills manage their gases. Sometimes they don't do anything at all. Sometimes they try to cap that methane and burn it instead of releasing the methane. Sometimes they burn it and produce electricity at the same time. That's obviously preferred. There's incineration, which burning your waste actually is, from a GHG perspective, a great idea. there might be some other concerns, but from a purely GHG perspective, solid waste and wastewater is quite a small source of emissions for pretty much every community out there, which is great news. And then imported emissions. So all of our activities from buying food, buying goods, buying air travel, and your energy and fuel. So these are always going to be, primarily. These are going to be another community's local emissions to produce this product or service. It includes the emissions associated with mining, with refining, processing, producing, or transporting fuel, energy, and then all of these materials, right? It's not the material itself most of the time that is responsible for the emissions. It's all of the energy it takes to produce that material, to mine for those, for rock, for example. Let's say it's gravel. You need to mine that rock. You need to transport that rock. You need to process that rock. You need to transport it again, and then you take it home and you use your gravel. So the gravel itself, the rock itself, doesn't really release any emissions at all, but everything it takes to get it from that raw state to the finished product is accounted for here. It's quite significant. And almost always, in my experience, this rivals or exceeds your local emissions. So really quite significant. So here is a different look at that earlier graph, excuse me, where we have a little bit more detail. You can see how building energy is broken up into electricity, natural gas, and other. Transportation is on-road versus off-road. So if you look here on the right, the imported emissions associated with the goods, food and beverage, upstream fuel, and air travel, you can see the bigger categories. From food and beverage, meat is quite significant. Beef products, lamb and goat meat, and dairy products, quite significant. Everything else kind of lesser. From goods, clothing, furniture, construction, vehicles and parts, those are really big sources. Clothing from oftentimes just producing that fabric, right? Cotton we have to grow, it's a crop. Furniture, a lot of wood or metal or things like that. Construction, once again, lots of wood, lots of metal, lots of fuel and energy associated with these. And then not only that, but taking into account the emissions associated with using that product, right? So if you're buying a vehicle, the emissions associated with creating the vehicle, not insignificant, but then also fueling that gasoline car for 15 years on average, much more significant than producing the car itself. Once again, these are more estimated emissions. There's just really not a good way to track these. So the local emission sources, you can compare these year over year in your GHG inventories, and you can get a really good sense of having pretty good accuracy on how things are trending. Imported emission sources, there isn't really a good way to track progress, unfortunately. So these are more for context for you to know as a community what else you should be looking at, that where else you can create change, right? Fixing your things instead of buying new stuff, making conscious choices about your food and beverages, what kind of footprint comes along with that. Making sure you understand the footprint upstream for your fuel, and minimizing your air travel. These are real decisions that you can make as an individual, much easier than you can on a community scale, unfortunately. But altogether, it has a bigger impact than your local emission sources. But a reminder still that those imported emissions are occurring in another community, and ideally that community is working on lowering their footprint, and your focus should still be on reducing your local emission sources as well. If everyone focuses on their local emissions, we can lower everyone's footprint, but still be very conscientious of your imported emissions, because they are quite significant. And so I know I showed this slide earlier, But I just wanted to point out once again, this GHG inventory is only this step one in the process, right? You need to accompany your GHG inventory with setting goals and creating a climate action plan and continuing to go back to measure and report what you're doing. There's many different versions of having a climate action plan. There's no wrong way to do it. You can have a climate action plan that focuses on reducing your GHGs. That's my specialty. I look at what kind of impacts from a numbers perspective different climate actions will have. You can also look at how prepared you are for climate change in your community. How will the physical conditions change in your community? What is your level of resilience or not for a changing climate? How might people migrate into or out of your community due to climate change? How might farming or weather or storms change in the future? So I'm finally ready for the Q&A. Let me know what questions you have.
I have a question actually. If a lot of these are based on estimates, or especially imported emissions, how do we make progress then? Or how do we track progress? Because like, if the population hasn't changed or if spending hasn't changed, how does it look like we've made any progress?
Yeah, it does. I will say this one it's really tricky, and I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer. So this comes up for a lot of our clients. You could look at a lot of my clients are cities and counties, so city governments. You can look at how many fix-it fairs have come up. You can look at how many stores are around in your community, like thrift stores that are selling used goods, used furniture instead of new goods and furniture. But at the end of the day, perhaps surveys might be the best way to go about this. I will say this is a lot easier for a business to do, to look at their supply chain, than it is for a community to do for their consumption-based emissions, because there's very limited number of data sources to begin with to estimate what the emissions are. So there, for now, is not a great way to measure. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, though. So that is my very unsatisfying answer to you.
If the imported emissions are local emissions elsewhere, how do we not double count those, or does it not matter if you're focused on your community versus another community?
That's a great question. So there is technically a little bit of double counting going on, but it really isn't a lot, because most communities in the US do not have very significant manufacturing, with the exception of, I would say, food for a county. So let me go back. Here, I'll go back here. I would say that for a larger community where there's agriculture, the agriculture, forestry, and land use section, assuming it's mostly agriculture, would be something you could argue is mostly imported for another community, and you could theoretically exclude. And then, sorry if I'm making you dizzy, for something like this, if you have a large industrial sector, you could theoretically exclude the industrial side of things as well. But that's the majority of it, other than, of course, transportation for, say, freight. But a lot of the freight transportation is for local uses. So you could look at excluding those. There are versions of GHG inventories that only look at consumption from a broader perspective than just what we are showing here as imported, where you would look at your imported emissions as well as your electricity and fuel use. I don't really like doing those, because I feel like it doesn't show the big picture, which is truly we have both local and imported emission sources. So I don't think there's enough double counting to be concerned for the majority of US communities, especially cities. Now, if we were talking about another country that has a lot of manufacturing, say China, that would be different, where we know that the arguably the majority of their emissions are from producing goods that go elsewhere. But for 9 out of 10 communities in the US, that is not the case, with the exception of, like I said, agriculture and some industry.
How do hybrid vehicles work in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions? And is that something that if you created a separate category, how much of it would be taken up? That's not the right way to say it, but.
No, I understand your question. That's a great question. So I am not up to date on the most recent numbers, but in my experience, hybrid gasoline vehicles are roughly half of or double the fuel economy, half of the fuel use of your typical internal combustion engine. So if all gasoline vehicles, all passenger cars were hybrids, you would see that number cut in half. So I'm glad we're on this slide. So it would cut it down quite significantly, but not enough to reduce the transportation sector to lower than another category, I wouldn't think. I will say half is great, but we know that by 2050 we need to reduce 90 to 100%, and let's be real, that really means 100% of our emission sources. So I think for now, having a hybrid vehicle is great, but the sooner people can switch to non-gasoline vehicles altogether, primarily electric vehicles, as we know. I know there's hydrogen fuel cell as well, but that's more appropriate for freight, in my opinion. But electric vehicles, not only can you purchase renewable electricity, the engine itself is 5.5 times as efficient as converting that energy from the electricity into momentum for the vehicle. With gasoline, on average, 30% is what you're actually getting to use of that burnt fuel. Everything else is lost as heat. And that's still true for hybrid vehicles, that a lot of it is lost as heat. But we get to combine it with some electricity, which is really, really efficient at making stuff move, which is great.
Yeah,
Yes,
nitrous oxide, that's laughing gas, isn't it?
It sure is.
Yeah, but we're not laughing. And I'd like to know the sources of the other gases. I mean, we're on top of the carbon dioxide with fossil fuels, but what about the other sources? We need in our plan, we need to abate the production of those gases.
Yes. So I can share about that a little bit as we go through all the different sources, but when vehicles produce trace amounts of nitrous oxide, and a lot of nitrous oxide is from farming and agriculture, especially manure management. So, right, if you have a large, let's say, a dairy farm, and if they manage their manure by putting it in a pool of, a big pit of manure versus, pasture raised, and getting to naturally decompose, that produces nitrous oxide, right? Nitrogen and oxygen. And wastewater treatment is another big source. It has a lot to do with proteins from animals breaking down. And I know Brad knows a lot more about chemistry than I think I do, but in terms of activities, I think those, vehicles and engines, agriculture and farming, wastewater treatment, those are the main sources of nitrous oxide in the community. It's not the biggest source, and certainly your dentist office, that is not what's gonna make or break your carbon footprint for the year, but that is correct. It's laughing gas.
Clearly, nitrous oxide is a bad for it and the effect, but isn't the amount of these greenhouse gases that's being produced rather the biggest devil? And which is the greatest sector? I mean, is it fossil fuels as we've been thinking, or what?
So, I think worldwide, I can't recall exactly, but carbon dioxide is still 80 to 90% of our emissions, like in terms of CO2e. So carbon dioxide is still the main one we need to worry about. I would say nitrous oxide for transportation it's less than 1% of the CO2 equivalent. So it's not the main culprit there. Where nitrous oxide is the most prevalent is in fertilizers in agriculture, and in manure management for animals as well as wastewater. But again, wastewater, it depends on what kind of setup you have. What some it's more methane, some it's more nitrous oxide. And so I want to say that worldwide nitrous oxide, even as a CO2 equivalency, it's less than 5% of emissions.
So how do we control it with manure, for instance, on the pig farms? Iowa has like an immense amount. I mean, their output of manure in like 3 days is the equivalent of human output for the whole year.
Yeah. You know, that's a great question. I don't think I have a full answer, but I know it depends on the animal. And it depends a lot on if you contain the manure or not, right? Are you letting it run off into water, to rivers and tributaries? Because that's the main, as far as I know, where it's primarily generated is when it mixes with water and runs off.
That's a big problem in Iowa.
What's that?
It's a big problem in Iowa.
I believe it. In Iowa, very much, what is it, like Iowa and North Carolina are the two main pig farming states in the country, and it's more so than everyone else combined. Something like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Claudia. Appreciate it very much.
Nice meeting you all. Thanks for letting me present, and good luck with everything that you pursue in the future.
Our nephew lives in Eugene, Oregon. That's how I made the connection. We were just out there. And I saw their, I wanted to see their climate action plan. So I saw it, I read it, and I was absolutely shocked about the imported CO2 or the imported greenhouse gases. In my experience, I'm looking at Paul because he knows a lot about this stuff, but in my experience, communities almost always, the ones that I've seen, are what she called scope 1, or in other words, what greenhouse gases do we produce in the community by driving around in our industry and all that kind of stuff. But I hope that you noticed that the takeaway is that what we import can be greater than that. And what we import, to your point, Bob, is what we choose. That's our choice. Now, to some extent, certain things aren't a choice. But let's take the issue of Iowa pork. Okay, so if all of us became vegetarians, that problem goes away. Just like that. If everybody became vegetarian, we would not have that problem. So, in sort of an answer to what you were asking, I think, Alex, when people make choices to reduce their meat consumption, and it's not just pork, of course, and it's not just manure, it's the whole deal. So when you reduce your meat consumption, you reduce the amount of imported greenhouse gases by choice, and you have total control of that. And what I've always felt a little overwhelmed by, I don't usually share all of this stuff, but what I have usually felt overwhelmed by when I read greenhouse gas surveys and stuff, it's like electricity and transportation. You just think, man, I don't have control over that stuff. I mean, what can I do? But I have control about what I buy, what I eat, and then the point that Bob always makes, and I admire that, I respect that, is demand consumption. Demand reduction, reduce the amount of stuff. Bill McKibben, many of you have heard of Bill McKibben, very well known environmental activist, incredibly prolific writer, and a wonderful guy. And he was here in Rockford. We had a chance to talk with him, and he said two things: stop burning stuff, stop buying stuff. Now, I heard that stop burning stuff is simply put, is a nice way to put it, but stop buying stuff? Well, yeah. Stop buying stuff. This is the linear economy versus the circular economy. You know, use stuff over and over and over again. Don't keep mining it, making it, using it, and throwing it away in the landfill and then go back and do it again. I wanted to say to Claudia, and I will in a later thing, you know, all of the exceptions that you said, that you talked about, unless you have a large airport. Do we have a large airport? We have one of the largest UPS and Amazon sites in the country. I think it ranks number 3. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
So we have a large airport. What about landfills? Oh my God, we have like the largest landfill in the state of Illinois. And we have, by actual measurement, therefore, the largest methane production in the state of Illinois. We're number 1, you know? So, and then there's industry. We've got that. We've got a lot of it. We also have a regional wastewater treatment facility here. You may not know that, but it's out there just past 3333 Kishwaukee Avenue. Now, it is a LEED silver building or something like that. And it's wonderful. They generate electricity from the methane that's produced by the aerobic digestion. But still, we have that. We have all that stuff. We can't get rid of the wastewater treatment plant, but here's something you can do about that. You can't stop pooping, okay? Keep pooping. Keep pooping. But you can use, if you have a garbage disposal, use it minimally, because that contributes. Okay, what you put down the drain and stuff contributes. So be careful about this. So you can affect that. We can't affect the fact that we have this large airport, and I have no data on this, but my suspicion is, yes, buy less and also buy local. Stop having your thing shipped in because I gotta have it tomorrow. I have to have it tomorrow. You know, take ground. If you've got a choice on delivery, take ground. You know, ease off, take your foot off the pedal of your life and just relax a little bit and don't demand everything like right now. Sorry about that. Speaking of which. So, you know, you do have controls. And not just the meat, but you also saw in there dairy and furniture. I mean, I'm Swedish. I have a natural affinity to IKEA, but the stuff that they make doesn't last very long. Buy stuff that lasts.
It's true.
Buy stuff that lasts. I know right now, my kids don't want our furniture, okay, for whatever reason, but that's going to change. That's got to change. We can't just keep this linear economy of just dig it up, produce it, and throw it away.
And put it in storage units.
Yeah. The average house in Europe is 1,100 square feet. The average house in the US is 2,300 square feet. I mean, that alone tells you what we're used to, what our habits are. Well, there was one other thing I wanted to mention, and I think this is really significant that I learned in reading the Eugene, Oregon Climate Action Plan. And Claudia didn't bring this up, but she knows a lot about this. The state of Oregon produces this scope 2 or this consumer-based production, what you bring in. They measure this as a state. They had, and now that I know that Claudia is Swedish, this is not a surprise. That report was done by the Stockholm Environmental Institutes. Pretty likely there's a connection there, but it's the total scope 2 or consumption-based greenhouse gases by income groups. By income groups. Well, guess what? If you got more money, you buy more stuff. And so the richer you are, the more likely, or your group or whatever, the folks who are in the highest categories are most likely to produce the most greenhouse gases because they buy more stuff. They fly more, you know, they do everything kind of at the high end. I'm not being critical of that. I'm just saying.
And they're the least effective too.
And they are the least affected and they are producing the most of it. So in some ways, do people even know that? I mean, the folks that, when you see this graph that I saw in the climate action plan, there's a line across the top that goes from vulnerable to ability to act. So the higher your income, the more choices you have. You have more ability, you have more freedom to make choices. The lower your income, the less ability you have, the more vulnerable you have, more vulnerable you are to the world and everything like that. So the point is that people who have this world's goods have the ability to make choices, more so than folks who don't have this world's goods. Now, we're not going to go out and beat up rich people or anything like that, because some of us are those people, and that's okay. But that just means we got to do our part. We got to do our part. And this is a huge revelation, because as a grassroots organization, you might think, well, what can we do? Because we can't stop the trains and the airplanes. We can't change how many cars are driving and all that kind of stuff. But the consumer-based imported greenhouse gases tells us the exact opposite. The choices we make are incredibly powerful, and no government policy whatsoever can control that. You can decide whether or not to eat pork. You can decide whether or not to drink milk. You can decide whether or not to buy dairy. You can decide whether or not to buy crap furniture or good stuff to last, or better yet, something that's used. You can decide whether to go to the thrift store or go to Kohl's. You have all of that power. And people may be telling you, or you may get the message, it doesn't matter. I'm just a little guy. Absolutely not true. And so as a grassroots organization, we have a really big responsibility. When I say we, I mean, to let people know this stuff. I didn't know it. I didn't know this. And I know so like everything, you know. I think I do, and of course it's not true. And then I talk to Sue and I realize I don't know everything. Or my kids. So we have to realize that unless we talk about this stuff, the people that need to know, that have actionability, they have agency, they won't know. It's really important that we talk about this. This is not something that is going to necessarily come out of a climate action plan that is focused on what are called the sector greenhouse gases, or the scope 1. It's us. We are super important.